guys. This is August 12th, 2021, and we are going to be discussing this article that I just read not too long ago, and it is from the Christian Post. And it says Black civil rights activist says America has a grace problem, not a race problem. Now, I started reading this article and I was like, let me go ahead and check it out. But there was a bunch of good points, and I said, you know what, gonna have to do this for the Christian news segment. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and get into this because there is quite a bit of information that has to be read and looked at, and I promise you guys this is a pretty interesting article. So let's just go ahead and get into it. This picture, it says demonstrators participate in the get your knee off our necks commitment march in Washington D.C. on August 28th, 2020. I remember that, the whole get your knee off our necks things that was sparked by the whole George Floyd movement. But anyway, a longtime African American neighborhood empowerment leader slammed critical race theory during an evangelical seminary webinar over the weekend, arguing that the United States has a quote grace problem instead of a quote race problem. Bob Woodson, the director of the Woodson Center and founder of the National Center for Neighborhood Enterprise, participated in the Southern Evangelical Seminary's online event Saturday. Quote, awaken, thinking well about wokeism, social justice, and racial reconciliation, end quote. The civil rights veteran, who once worked on community development programs for local and national organizations, including the NAACP, asked, is America systemically racist? Very good question. We know that there are different people who got different views about that, but let's just see what his take is on it. Watson shared his belief that critical race theory, a theoretical framework, a theoretical framework on systemic racism in America being pushed by some in academia and the political left, quote, should be replaced by critical grace theory. Well, you guys know I did a video not too long ago covering Tony Evans with his kingdom grace theory, right? So everybody kind of got their critical something theory or all of these different theories. But of course, me as a Christian, I'm just like, let's just get to the scripture. Let's just stick with the Bible. But I'm not gonna make a mountain out of a molehill. Uh, Now, this is what he says. Quote, America does not have a race problem, but it has a grace problem. End quote, Woodson said. Woodson attributed the problems ailing African Americans and contemporary African American society to the expansion of the social safety net instead of systemic racism. I agree. Woodson explained that, quote, when whites were at their worst, blacks were at their best. I, that's it. Listen, thank you guys for watching the video. Like, rate, share, comment, subscribe. You guys have a blessed day. I'm just gonna cut this video short. How many times have you guys heard me say that in my videos? That when it seems like that white people were oppressing black people the worst, it seems like we did the best. And he basically just said that. And this man is he's a person who was in the civil rights movement. He discussed the role of the black church in helping to improve the lives of African Americans in the century following the abolition of slavery. Upon discovering that the black community had a 75% literacy rate, Woodson said, I'm sorry, illiteracy, not literacy. So he had they I'm sorry, let me read that again. Upon discovering that the black community had a 75% illiteracy rate, Woodson said many black churches open Sabbath schools. Uh oh. He about to start talking some of that Hebrew Israelite stuff, man. We got to be careful. I'm just kidding, guys. Um, excuse me. Within 40 years, quote, within 40 years, that level of literacy went down from 75% to 30%, he recalled. Woodson detailed how, quote, Christian values and, quote, Christian principles enabled the African American community to experience relative peace and prosperity despite the adversity they faced due to the Great Depression and racism. This is what people forget. During the 30s and 40s, extreme racism in the South, also with the Great Depression, who do you think suffered the most? Black people in the Great Depression. While you had a lot of guys and people who had money killing themselves because they were just losing their shirts left and right, black people had to hunker down and they had to fight through it. People don't remember that. You know, you just coming out of slavery less than 100 years. What? I want to say about 60 years. People who were living in the Great Depression, they probably had grandparents who were born as slaves. And the Great Depression, and then you come out of slavery, you're experiencing racism in the South. You got people that's probably still living that were born as slaves. And here it is in the 1930s, the Great Depression hits while you're experiencing racism in the South. I, you got to put these things in perspective. Uh, quote, we had the highest marriage rate of any other group in society during the Great Depression because of our faith and because of our attitude to self determination, he explained. Great Depression, just came out of slavery. We had the highest marriage rate than any other group in society during the Great Depression. While the economy was crumbling, racism was probably at its highest during that time. Black people were getting married more than what they're doing now. Than the probably the best time in black history to date, which is this is the best time for black people in America to date. But anyway, let's continue to read. Quote: Elderly people could walk safely in house. In I'm sorry, elderly people could walk safely in those communities without fear of being assaulted by their grandchildren. Some of the things that people don't talk about in the black communities is how you got a lot of these little young dudes, teenagers out here robbing, hurting, and some points killing old elderly people who live right there in the neighborhood. But no one wants to talk about that. Quote, 85% of all black households had a man and a woman raising children. Oh my gosh. This is the stuff I've been harping on for so long, guys. This is why I speak so much against critical race theory because they don't talk about this stuff. Quote, I'm sorry, he added, noting that, quote, church attendance was the absolute highest. Now, again, let's recap this because I know that this is going over some people's heads right now. Slavery just ended 60 years prior. Great Depression. Illiteracy rate was 75%. Right? Oppressed, heavily oppressed, broke during the Great Depression. It wasn't like that black people can just go out and just put in an application and just start working. Why? Because they were being oppressed. The time where the economy was the worst in the history of this country. And now the black households were intact. The church attendance was high under the times where it was the worst for black people. I want to say during the Great Depression, after these people had just got out of slavery, after the slaves had just got out of slavery, I want to say that it was probably the worst time for blacks in American history. My great grandmother was born in the 1920s. So she lived through this time in the 1920s and in the 30s during the Great Depression in the South, in Georgia. She lived through all of that. All right, let's continue. There's a lot to cover. He lamented that the culture shifted in 1965 when quote leftist sociologists, same people that we're dealing with today, at a Columbia University School of Social Work began to quote promote socialism and use the plight of blacks to accomplish their goal. Please, people. Oh my gosh. This is a guy who is a part of the well, he was a part of the civil rights movement, so he knows what he's talking about. This man has been a part of the civil rights movement, and he sees the fugazi. He sees where leftist sociologists, these are the same people that's screeching out there today, riling you up, black man, black woman, in order to what? Accomplish their goal. They did it in the 60s, and they're doing it again. And what has the black community got? Zilch. Nothing. Nothing has happened. Our communities are in worse shape than what they were back then. Let's continue to read. Excuse me. What's it said that these sociologists sought to, quote, separate work from income, thereby making fathers, quote, redundant and leading to an, quote, increase in drug addiction and the school dropout rate. Sorry, guys, I'm getting a little parched. Excuse me. Don't know what's going on. Woodson said that these sociologists sought to, quote, I'm sorry, I already read that part. They aspired to, quote, enlist as many people as they could to go into the welfare system, he said, which will force America to change and to begin to redistribute income. How many people, how many of us are talking about, or have heard this, quote, redistribution of income? We need to redistribute income. Yeah, they did it. They did it in the black neighborhoods. And they're still doing it now. And I can't believe that people are still falling for this. At this time in American history, government poverty programs began to, quote, open offices and recruit people into the welfare system, he continued. Quote, over the course of 3 or 4 years in the 70s, millions of blacks flooded into the welfare system at a time when the unemployment rate in New York for black men was 4%. Wow, he asserted. Quote, as a consequence, we saw out of the wedlock birth rate, out of wedlock birth rate began to soar. There was this massive decline. As government intervened and began to take the place of the family, we witnessed the kind of decline that we're experiencing today. That's why I'm just like this whole woke ism stuff, woke this, woke that, woke church. You're perpetuating this stuff. You basically just you're you're taking a bait. You're just taking a bait. Born in 1937, Woodson served with organizations such as the National Urban League in New York City during the 70s. Afterward, he served as a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and also directed the neighborhood revitalization project in Washington, D.C. Excuse me. Woodson's organization, the Woodson Center, seeks to bring, quote, bring recognition and funding to strengthen the efforts of indigenous neighborhood leaders and organizations that are effectively addressing critical problems of their communities through innovative initiatives, end quote. So this is what we should be doing. This is what the black community should be doing. Now I haven't looked up into the Woodson Center, but from what I just brought, I mean, from what I just read, I think that this is what we should be doing. I mean, you know, Black Lives Matter collected all of that money and they did nothing. Woodson said the organization applies, quote, the principles that operate in our market economy to the social economy. Specifically, here, he illustrated that, quote, only 3% of people in our market economy are entrepreneurs, but they generate 70% of all the jobs, end quote. Facts. He emphasized that quote, if you say that 70% of the black families today are raising children that are dropping out of school, in jail, on drugs, it means that 30% are not, end quote. Quote, what the Woodson Center has done over the course of 40 years is we have gone into these 30% of households and we found the Christian virtues alive and well, end quote, he said. Wow. So the 30% of the people that's not falling into this whole stereotype of black folks in the hood and all of that stuff. Um, these are the people that still hold into these values that are not fitting this stereotype, right? In these households, quote, people are raising children successfully in the presence of these challenges, end quote. The Woodson Center said, I'm sorry, the Woodson Center has studied the quote successful efforts of these households and worked to promote them in the African community as a whole. He presented, quote, powerful examples of people who are achieving against the odds and true stories about the impact of the black church and Christianity in reversing the fortunes of the black community in some parts of the country. Let me continue. In one example, he mentioned gangsters had, quote, taken over a public housing development in Washington, D.C. But when, quote, some Christian women came together and formed a management system and began to uh, reculture, uh, reculturate people, the situation in the neighborhood had turned around. But these are the things that people don't talk about that's happening in the church. Oh, the black church this, oh, the black church that, oh, y'all not doing this, y'all not doing that. But stuff like this, you ain't gonna hear nobody talking about that. Never. You'll never hear them talking about it. But it's happening. And the Lord continues to have his people in positions to do his work. Quote, they drove the big drug dealers out. I'm sorry, they drove the drug dealers out and they began to minister to these children to mentor them. In the course of 10 years, 600 of these children from desolate, crime ridden, drug infested neighborhood I'm sorry, drug infested neighborhood came to become restored and they went on to college. Wow. He recalled. Woodson praised the efforts of a man named Leon Watkins who lived in South Central Los Angeles, where the East Side Crips were, quote, terrorizing the community. According to Woodson, Watkins, quote, put wanted signs all over and, quote, met with these gang members one on one. Watkins met with the leader of the gang and talked to him for 3 hours. Wow. But remember, the black church doesn't do anything in these communities. They don't do anything. Quote, the next day he had him in Bible study, and in 1 week he had him, he had the whole 26 member gang in Bible study. He continued, oh my gosh, man, that's great. That's great. Um, quote, the gang went from terrorizing that community to protecting that community, Woodson said. He cited the aforementioned examples as part of a curriculum framework that pushes back against critical race theory by, quote, taking lessons from the past and sharing the stories of, quote, the present of grace in action, end quote. So basically, by pushing back against critical race theory, this neighborhood has been turning around. Critical race theory hasn't been doing this. They ain't doing it. Not doing it at all. Woodson urged people to follow the advice of the late civil rights icon Dr. Martin Luther King, who believed that, quote, we should not enter into this bitter conflict with a purpose of humiliating or destroying our enemy, but we should do so with God's love and God's grace, and we should do so with the goal of transforming the oppressor. End quote. Quote, King believed that the goal was not to defeat or humiliate the adversary, but to humanize him or her, to plant the seeds of friendship or eventual alliance, end quote, Woodson maintained. Quote, Dr. King called that spiritual aggression. Woodson portrayed critical race theories as the antithesis to this line of thinking. Critical race theory is defined by Encyclopedia Britannica as an intellectual movement and loosely organized framework of legal analysis that argues race is a socially constructed category used to quote use to oppress and exploit end quote people of color. The reference source that the reference source I'm getting tongue tied this morning, guys. The reference source reports that critical race theorists hold that law hold that the law and legal institutions in the United States are inherently racist insofar as they function to create and maintain social, economic, and political inequalities between whites and non-whites, especially African Americans. End quote. Quote, it is really stereotyping that we should be defined not by God's judgment uh, not by God's judgment on us or God's grace, but that we should be defined as a group, as a category. Woodson agreed. Argued. Describing that idea as, quote, ridiculous and, quote, really harmful, Woodson stressed that, quote, a lot of quotes here. That's what we fought against, end quote. After quoting from King's famous call to quote be viewed by the content of your character and not by the color of your skin, he slammed critical race theory for saying that quote we ought to be defined by the color of our skin, not by our actions. Oh, I'm sorry. That we ought to be defined by the color of our skin, not by our actions. Wow, it's saying that that's what critical race theory preaches, that you should be defined by your skin color, not by your actions. Uh, while most of his speech focused on the challenges facing the African American community, Wilson argued that the United States as a whole is quote in a moral and spiritual free fall that is consuming people of all classes and in all areas, end quote. Totally agree. Do not disagree with that. We are in a spiritual free fall, moral free fall. Why? Because people are rejecting the gospel, they reject the Bible. And this is what happens when you reject the Bible and you reject Christ. The culture just it just starts to denigrate. What's pointed to quote a moral and spiritual emptiness in the lives of our young people end quote who are wandering through life without consent or purpose in their life. He warned that quote when you wander life without content or purpose, you devalue life and therefore you won't hesitate to take someone else's or your own. End quote. I he's summing it up right there. Totally agree. Quote, we must address this crisis among our young people today, but we cannot do that as long as we are divided in this nation by race. Woodson concluded. I think that this current racial crisis is a manufactured crisis by elements on the radical left that really wants to seize on America's birth defect of slavery and Jim Crow as a bludgeon against the country to undermine the virtues and principles of this nation. I'm going to take it a step further and say that people want to use this as a way um, to undermine the gospel. So, therefore, you name the country as a racist country, and then you say that this country was built on the Bible. So, therefore, we need to throw away the Bible because if you hold to the Bible, this is what it leads to. It leads to oppression, racism, all of that. So that's why a lot of that's why I'm just like this whole woke church thing. You know, is either people are really ignorant on that, or they just really don't know what they're doing. So Father, forgive them for they know not what they do. Those are the only two things. They're really, or unless they're trying to push an agenda, that's a third option. But I don't want to think that these guys are actually trying to push an agenda, but I think that they have been deceived by Satan. Let me go ahead and read this last sentence. The Christian Post executive Richard Edwards Land was the president of SES until July 2021 and presently serves as an adjunct professor and president emeritus. Emeritus. Ah, sorry, never heard of that word, but probably butchered it. But anyway, guys, yeah, pretty good article. Pretty good article. Yeah, I know this is about wow, it's almost 30 minutes that I've been covering this article. It was a lot to read, lot to read, lot to unpack there. Um, and this is a guy who's a civil rights leader. He's a civil rights leader. I mean, who's going to argue with a man who was actually born in the Great Depression and he was a 30 something year old man by the time the 60s rolled around? This man saw the stuff firsthand. And here he is, when it says that he's, how old is he now? When he's in his 80s? He was born in 1937, so I don't feel like doing the math. But anyway, yeah, this is a man who is in his 80s, most likely. This man knows what he's talking about. He's seen it firsthand. So who are we in our 30s and 40s, and maybe even in our 50s, to question what this man is saying? I mean, he saw it. He saw it. But this is why us as Christians, I don't care if you're black or you're white, this is why we need to stay away from that critical race theory thing, and we need to just continue to address it. Don't just let it slide because we don't want to offend anybody. No, let's stand on truth. Let's call these folks out that are using this as a weapon, as a tool to try to divide the church. Because some of these folks are doing this, and I think they're doing it out of ignorance. Some people are probably doing it for money. Some people are just a part of it, and I believe that there are some people who are genuinely a part of this, and they really believe that there's a lot of racism going on that needs to be addressed, and they may feel like that no one has done a good job about it. Maybe the church. So we got to take all of that stuff into account. But anyway, guys, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap this up. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Do you believe that America doesn't have a grace problem? That is more of a race problem? That this country is inherently racist? And unless we are able to tear down the system and change the culture and address this in our churches, we're going to continue to be in the same boat? Or do you happen to believe that no, this man, Dr. Woodson, is correct? We do have a grace problem, not a race problem. Because when blacks were at their worst, the black community flourished, and there is the numbers and there's the receipts to back it up. But anyway, whatever you guys think, let me know in the comment section below. And as always, like this video, rate it, share it, subscribe, hit that notifications bell, guys. Every time I get ready to go live or I got a premiere or post or whatever, you guys will be the first to see it. And as always, you guys have a blessed day and enjoy your morning.